which one of these ecosystems would you most like to visit? Tropical rainforest, Arctic tundra, desert. It's recording now, yes. Grassland or savanna, as we call it. Taiga, which is the boreal forests, or a temperate forest. Grassland for Kira. What about you, Jack? Oh, yeah. I'd love to visit the rainforest, too. I went once in Ecuador a long time ago, but it's been a while. You know, I should get like pictures of myself in some of these places because, first of all, it'd look funny to see me when I was young, probably. And you know, like that guy does on the guy does it on his lessons sometimes. He shows, oh, this is when I was in Tanzania, or this is when I was in wherever, because I guess he traveled a lot. The teacher in this class. Oh, you prefer the rainforest too? Oh, I see. All right. Well, don't forget about aquatic ecosystems because there are aquatic ones too. Marine, meaning ocean, and then freshwater ecosystems. And all of these are ways that groups of different populations of animals and plants interact and together create sort of a functioning ecosystem. And they function to do a lot of things, some of which, actually a lot of which, benefit humanity. Although we're not going to go into that too much today. So as you know, we should now be finishing human biology and starting ecology, which you have about 2 weeks to finish before the last thing, which is looking at environmental changes. And then we're all done. Boom. 3.5 weeks, I guess 4 weeks left, basically. Crazy to think about. So one of the things we want to think about now as we're thinking about groups of animals living together, groups of plants and animals, is how to categorize their relationships and their and the ways that the different levels, I guess, of organization. We've talked about the body and how the body is organized into organ systems and organs and all those different things. But now we're talking about many different organisms which have different sort of levels of organization. That starts with an individual organism like an elk here, and then a population of elk, which means in one place there might be, say, a herd of elk, or maybe 2 or 3 herds of elk that all use or live in the same area. So they'd be a population within an ecosystem. Then there's a community of plants and animals that live and interact together and affect each other and compete with each other for things. And then there's a whole ecosystem, and the ecosystem then includes not just the animals and plants, but also the non-living things. What are some non-living things that are pictured in this ecosystem here? Or what is a non-living thing? Exactly. So water is one of the non-living, or what we call abiotic, means not living, components of the ecosystem. And also rock, you know, the rock of this mountain would be another abiotic. The air that all these animals are breathing would be another abiotic factor in the ecosystem. So let's get back to my slides here. So the levels of ecology, a habitat, which is not mentioned here, is simply an area, the area within the ecosystem where the organism's needs are met. And that's another word that I just wanted to include to make sure that was included so I didn't forget it. Wind, yes, Kira, exactly. That can affect as well. So there are biotic factors in an ecosystem, which means the animals, the plants, the living things, even the dead animals and plants can provide habitat for other things. And here's actually a way of looking at that. You can see on the top picture here the whole ecosystem. Then you see some of the abiotic factors down below: sunlight, temperature, precipitation, which means, what does precipitation mean? Any ideas? Nobody wants to take a guess? Nobody's heard that word before, precipitation? It basically means rain, but it can also mean snow. It means any form of, any way in which water reaches the surface of the Earth from the sky. So precipitation, water, moisture in the atmosphere itself, and then soil. So you can see those are the abiotic factors, and then the biotic factors are the plants and animals. And these are the different categories of plants and animals there might be. You put those two together, and you get a whole ecosystem up top, which includes those biotic and abiotic factors. So down here, we basically have a community, as we defined it before, but we don't have yet an ecosystem until you also include the abiotic factors, the non-living factors. And within in your habitat or within your ecosystem, you're going to have a niche. And a niche is basically a place that's, you know, if you have a niche at home, it's sort of like the place where you belong, or the spot that's all yours. Well, that's kind of the case here as well. And a good example of this is these different types of warblers. And they actually, if they all competed with each other, they might get into a lot of fights over the tree. But they've actually sort of divvied things up in a way where the Cape May warbler feeds the tops of the spruce trees. This other one feeds sort of in the middle area. And this one down here feeds at the bottom area. It's just something they've developed over time and have gotten used to and in the habit of. So they have a niche in the ecosystem. That's kind of where they are and where they belong. Now people can encroach on that. Perhaps if some disease or forest fire burns the bottoms of all the trees, well, these birds here are going to start competing more with the other birds to eat the food up higher up on the tree. So that niche would be impeded. Or squirrels might come and, they might occupy the same niche in some ways, or the niches might overlap. But a niche is the place where you might eat or where you might sleep or where you might live as an animal or a plant. Another example would be the trees themselves. Tall trees have the niche of sort of being up high in the canopy and getting a lot of the sunlight, which tends to shade out a lot of the grasses and things on the bottom. And that would be the niche of those. And oftentimes the niche involves the benefits you can give to other animals as well. And we'll talk about the different ways that plants and animals can benefit each other in just a moment. So you might think of a niche as just being your role in the ecosystem, the role that you play. All right, and then there's a section they have on population size, the concept of carrying capacity, which is basically how much of a population can be supported in a place. So in other words, if we go back here, maybe I can't. How many elk can this particular area support? How many elk can live here before there's too much competition or not enough available resources for the elk to live? So this carrying capacity is based on, and so the answer might be 100. There might be 100 elk that can live in this river valley before you're just not going to have any more that will be able to be supported. So it's based on something called limiting factors, which obviously are factors that limit the number of the species that can live there. So you can see an example here. What seems to be the limiting factor in the fishbowl to how many fish can survive in this fishbowl? You sort of know intuitively, right? There's a limiting factor. You're not going to be able to fit too many fish in there before some of them start dying. So yeah, maybe 5 is the number. Like that, maybe that's the carrying capacity of the fishbowl. But what is the limiting factor in the fishbowl? What seems to be the factor or the thing that's limiting the number of fish that can live there? So what is it about the fishbowl that limits the number of fish that can live there? Jack, any ideas? Oh, Jack. This is your conscience speaking. You better not be playing video games on your computer. So yes, Kiera, limited food and water, or just limited space. Simply space. Fish must need a certain amount of space to survive in. And you can imagine that if they start bumping into each other often, not as many of them are going to live. All right. So space was one of them, but food and water could be the other. You need a certain amount of water because the water needs to have oxygen in it. And if that water can't get enough oxygen in it for the fish to breathe, then they're not going to, they'll basically run out of oxygen too fast. Just like if we locked you in a small room and sealed it, then eventually you'd run out of air because you'd be breathing in all the oxygen, using it up, and breathing out carbon dioxide, which is not going to keep you alive. So this is the concept of carrying capacity, is that if you look at it on a graph, if you put a pair of frogs in somewhere, let's say here at this time, and you let time go by, which is what's happening on this axis of the graph, then the population size is going to increase. Now at first, the frogs have lots of room, and perhaps they have a niche that no one else has, so they have a lot of ability to grow and multiply. So there's going to be a lot of growth in those frogs. But eventually, when you get to a certain level, the frogs might be competing in a particular habitat or ecosystem for water, or for space, or for frog food. Or there might be predators that are like, oh, frogs are easy to eat. So they might keep the frog numbers in check at a certain level. I don't know who would eat frogs, like foxes, or who else eats frogs? Snakes. And if the snakes have a lot of easy food to eat, then they're going to probably grow and multiply as well, right? So there's actually going to be a balance. As the frog population increases, well, the snake population might increase too, and the snake population might get really big, and it might then eat so many frogs that the frog population decreases a little bit. But the frog population, if it decreases, then some of the snakes will die because there won't be enough food, and the frog population will go back up. So the frog population is going to, based on all these factors, including disease, reach a point called the carrying capacity. And it might be in a particular place. You don't eat frogs, that's good. Maybe it's 300. That's the capacity of how many frogs a particular pond can support before they start to die off as fast as they're born. So that's population size, carrying capacity, and limiting factors are the key terms there. And finally, symbiosis, which is one way in which animals relate to each other. Now, of course, animals compete with each other for food and shelter and resources. They also eat each other, right? Predators eat prey. So there are different ways they interact like that, but they also sometimes cooperate or interact with each other much more closely. And that's called symbiosis. And there are three forms of symbiosis, which we'll look at here real quick: mutualism, parasitism, and commensalism. Now, they're kind of big words, but they kind of make sense if you think about them. So parasitism, well, let's start with mutualism. Mutualism is when two animals kind of help each other out. And it's good. You can see they're both smiling, right? The two different types of animals are both happy because they both get something from the relationship. So a great example of that is, oh, you know what? A great example of that is a bee flying from flower to flower. Right? What does the bee get from the flower? Right, it gets pollen, but it also gets nectar, and that's why the bee is actually going to the flower, because it gets nectar. Well, it picks up the pollen and then spreads the pollen around to other flowers as it goes from flower to flower. And that is the way that flowers then reproduce. So it benefits the flowers because their pollen gets carried around, and it benefits the bees because they get a lot of nectar. So everybody wins, right? Well, parasitism, you can imagine, is when one animal, it's good for the animal. If the other animal, actually, it's bad for them, and can even eventually kill them in some ways. So you might imagine that in the case of a dog with fleas, we'd be dealing with parasite, right? A parasitism, where a parasite is infecting a host. That's what a parasite infects, is a host, because it helps the host live, but it actually causes the dog pain or problems or suffering. Oh, we'll be done in just a sec, Kira. This is the last slide. It's about to get cool, though, because we're going to meet a couple of interesting animals. And the final one, then, is commensalism, which is where one animal benefits and the other animal really doesn't, it doesn't really hurt or harm them at all. And that would be the case perhaps in clownfish, although I'll give you an argument why I think it might also be mutualism. But in this case, this is a very interesting relationship. You see the sea anemone has stinging tentacles, and it can actually eat, fish and things like that, and sting them and kill them. But the clownfish sort of gets close to it and gets stung a little bit and gets used to the sting, and then it develops this mucous membrane on the outside so that it isn't even affected anymore by the sea anemone. In fact, I'll show you a GIF image now of a little clownfish swimming around the sea anemone. Now, this benefits the clownfish because any other predators aren't going to get close to the clownfish, or if they do, they're going to get stung by the sea anemone, right? And you might say, well, it doesn't benefit the sea anemone at all, and that's what the argument here is, because of commensalism. But actually, the clownfish sometimes attracts other fish, like predators, to come close to the sea anemone, which provides food for the sea anemone. So in a sense, you could say maybe this is a mutualism relationship, but their example here would be that it's commensalism. Yeah. Another interesting one is the remora. Now, I don't have a picture of a remora with the shark, but if you look closely at the head, at the top of the head of this remora, you'll notice it has something that looks kind of funny on it, right? Kind of a pad almost, or something like that on the top of its head, or the back of its head. Sort of a big pad. Well, interestingly, the remora, and here you can see it a little more closely, actually has this sort of suction ability, and it can swim around. Yeah, exactly. It's a suction cup. It can swim around, and it can attach itself to animals like sharks or manta rays or things like that. And it can swim on its own, but it can also just be there attached to the shark, and then when the shark eats something, the remora can kind of pick up the scraps because it's there to pick up the scraps. So that benefits the remora. It doesn't really benefit the shark at all, though. In fact, I think it might even slow the shark down when it's trying to hunt, right? But that's the way the remora works, and it's an interesting relationship. A little bit different than you might recall the lamprey we saw before, where the lamprey actually sucks onto fish and animals, and then with its mouth and sort of sucks their blood, which is kind of disturbing. But the suction on this remora is just a little thing on its head, which is a really interesting, I think, relationship in the world. Again, that would be sort of commensalism, where the shark doesn't really receive any benefit from this, but the remora does. So you can remember these words. Mutualism means that mutually both people benefit. Parasitism means, one is a parasite. And commensalism, I'm not sure what actually the roots of that are. I'll have to look into that, I guess. Means that only one animal benefits. All right, that's it for today. And Kira, if you can't stick around or Jack, you're free to go, of course. Thank you for being here. Kira, if you can't stick around